When looking at a map of the United States, we can see that the states come in all shapes and sizes. Looking at these states side by side, we can see their shapes more clearly. While some states like Colorado, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and others are squares, rectangles, or just barely not a square or a rectangle, like Utah and New Mexico, other states, like the states of Texas and Michigan, have more unique shapes, and if you would like to learn more about their histories and how they came to look the way they do, we can talk about that in a future video. Please leave a comment if you'd be interested in that. But one state is so weirdly shaped that it very often stands out, and that state is the state of Maryland. Why is it shaped like that? Zooming in and taking a closer look at Maryland, we can see how truly weird its borders are. Why was Delaware carved out of Maryland? Who gave Virginia any part of the Delmarva Peninsula at all? Why is Maryland's tail almost pinched off? And why is D.C. carved out of land that is only Maryland's? Some might be surprised to learn that Maryland's original colonial charter actually laid out a state that looked something like this, a state that would be somewhat less weird looking, so this raises a lot of the same questions. How did Maryland get from its colonial borders to its modern day borders? The first thing we need to understand is that colonial borders were often vague, unclear, undefined, and also Maryland was full of Catholics. That's why every one of Maryland's neighbors took land from it. And yes, I'm counting you too, West Virginia. Let's start with Maryland's smallest neighbor, Delaware. The issue is actually pretty straightforward. Way back in 1674, the British kicked the Dutch out of Delaware, and Maryland immediately laid claim to the land. But the king ruled that Maryland actually only had claim to land taken from natives, and the Dutch are Protestants. So no Delaware for Maryland. Thanks a lot, Charles. Moving on to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is the reason Maryland almost lost its tail, and it all goes back to something called Cresap's War. Yeah, I didn't expect there to be a war involved either, but looking at this map you can immediately see that Maryland claimed all of Philadelphia, and needless to say, that wasn't going to happen, so war. In the 1710s, Marylanders wanted to settle in the north of the conflict area, and Pennsylvanians countered by trying to settle in the south. And that meant a royal intervention in the 20s, declaring a pause on all settlement. Both sides refused to listen to that, and in the 1730s, conflict broke out. Now it's worth noting here that this war did not actually result in any death. Rather, it was a series of threats, beatings, destruction of property, and a brief Maryland militia invasion of Lancaster County. But nobody died in this war. By the 1750s, this was still a running issue, and both Maryland and Pennsylvania had taken it to the courts. The courts had ruled that a British compromise line should be drawn up as the new border. In 1767, that border was solidified with the Mason-Dixon line. This put an end to Maryland's claims on Philadelphia and also almost pinched off western Maryland from the remainder of Maryland. They just didn't know that yet. And now moving on to Washington. The idea for Washington to be created in Maryland kind of goes back to the 1790 compromise between the Founding Fathers to locate the capital in the South. The Mason-Dixon line, the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland, was the border between the North and the South. They had agreed to locate the capital in the South, but Northerners weren't going to accept a capital too far in the South, so Maryland was the obvious contender. Originally, the capital wasn't meant to be made out of only Maryland land. It was meant to include Virginian land, too. Right here in the bottom corner of the Capital District, you can see what is now Alexandria. But then in 1847, Congress agreed to give Virginia its land back, leaving only the Maryland land to be the capital of the United States, and leaving us with the Capital District we're familiar with today. The dispute with Virginia over the southern tip of the Delmarva Peninsula is also relatively straightforward. Way back in colonial charter days, the entire Delmarva Peninsula was granted to Maryland in the Maryland Charter, but Virginians were already living on that southern tip, and as you'll recall from the issue with the Dutch, Maryland was not granted the authority to govern over other Christians. This remained an issue of contention up until the 1800s, when both Maryland and Virginia still claimed the land. But in 1877, Congress decided that Virginia could keep the southern tip so as not to upset the status quo. And that is how we get to the contemporary borders of Maryland. Through wars and kings and acts of Congress, it's been chopped into quite a weird shape. And also its flag is definitely the weirdest, but that's a whole different story for another time. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and if you liked the video, leave a like.